Thank you to Erica for asking me to speak today. I'm going to be speaking about official advice on the safety of radiofrequency radiation, risk assessment and adverse effects. Official advice matters because it affects all of our lives. It affects whether a phone mast can go up next to where you live. It affects whether parents are given advice about giving smartphones to their young children. It affects whether schools give tablets to children in classrooms. And it can affect whether pregnant women are given any advice about whether they should protect their unborn child from wireless devices. So it's very important that official advice is accurate and evidence-based. In the UK, official advice for radiofrequency radiation comes from Public Health England. They, for many years, have been advised by the Advisory Group on Non-Ionising Radiation, or AGNIR, and that was up until May 2017. Since May 2017, responsibility has fallen on the Committee on Medical Aspects of Radiation in the Environment, or COMAR. Public Health England has said they are responsible for making the public healthier. They protect the nation from public health hazards. They improve the health of the whole population. And they do this through world-leading science, knowledge and intelligence. In their Code of Conduct, they state that Public Health England is the authoritative national voice and expert service provider for public health. Public Health England staff shall conduct ourselves with integrity and honesty. We shall never deceive or knowingly mislead others, including customers, the public, colleagues, the Department of Health, ministers or Parliament. We will not misuse our official position to further our interests or those of others. AGNIR, the advisory group, last produced a report in 2012, and it was entitled Health Effects from Radiofrequency Electromagnetic Fields.
Sorry, was it on the 1st of April 2012?
It was on the 1st of April.
Very interesting.
You'll find that on the 1st of April 2013, the Health Protection Agency became Public Health England. So prior to that, it was called the Health Protection Agency. So in 2012, the Health Protection Agency welcomed this comprehensive and critical review of scientific studies prepared by the Independent Advisory Group on Non-Ionising Radiation. But they were independent from whom? 43% of the people in AGNIR were from the Health Protection Agency or the Department of Health, the groups to which AGNIR were reporting. 21% of AGNIR were part of ICNIRP, the body who set the International Exposure Guidelines. AGNIR were reporting on whether they could find evidence of effects below ICNIRP guidelines. In fact, the chair of AGNIR was also the chair of the ICNIRP Committee on Epidemiology. So AGNIR was not independent of the group they were reporting to or of the guidelines that they were assessing. The conclusions of the AGNIR report were that the evidence considered overall has not demonstrated any adverse health effects of radiofrequency field exposure below internationally accepted guidelines. The response from the Public Health Protection Agency was therefore a recommendation to follow the ICNIRP guidelines will remain central to the Health Protection Agency's advice on exposures to RF fields. But this is not surprising, since the chair of AGNIR and some other members were also part of ICNIRP. There's a conflict of interest. No matter what the evidence was, it would be very difficult for ICNIRP members to admit to effects below the ICNIRP guidelines. I published a paper at the end of 2016 assessing the AGNIR 2012 report. You can find it in the journal Reviews on Environmental Health. There's a link at the bottom of the slide. It's an open access paper. I reported that the review described incorrect, misleading statements, omissions and conflict of interest. The executive summary and overall conclusion did not accurately reflect the scientific evidence available. And I'd like to go through some of the reasons for this conclusion. I used possible effects on male fertility and oxidative stress as an example. Oxidative stress, as we've heard several times already today, is a damaging condition where free radicals and reactive oxygen species exceed the ability of the body to remove them. Only 7 studies in the report, in a section called reactive oxygen species, were included in the report that were identified. A few others were scattered throughout the report. That the dark shading shows that there were adverse effects reported. The lighter shading above shows that there were no adverse effects reported. So some other studies scattered throughout the report, but there was not really any mention of oxidative stress for those references. At least 40 studies had been omitted from the report. If these had been included, then 79% of studies, 61 out of 77, would have demonstrated evidence of oxidative stress. That's illustrated here. Far bigger than the 7 that were identified in the section. For male fertility, studies were divided into different chapters, so only a few in each section. The left-hand column, these were in cellular studies section, these were in animal studies, and these were in human studies. All of the human studies reported adverse effects, but at least 22 studies on male fertility were omitted. If these had been included, then 78% of studies, 35 out of 45, would have described adverse effects on sperm, male reproductive organs, or testosterone concentrations. The conclusions in the executive summary were, despite many studies investigating effects on male fertility, there is no convincing evidence that low-level exposure results in any adverse outcomes on testicular function. AGNIR were more convinced by the 12% that reported no effect than they were by the 78% that reported effects. For male fertility in humans, the conclusion was the limited available data on other non-cancer outcomes shows no effects of RF field exposure, but this was untrue. All of the human studies had reported effects. And oxidative stress wasn't even mentioned in the conclusions. So conclusions were left out, they were incorrect or inaccurate. I've listed techniques which AGNIR used to give the impression that there were no effects below the ICNIRP guidelines. I won't go through them now, because I've got limited time, but they're in the slides in case any of you would like to look at it at a later date. I'd like to mention some other examples from the report. For cognitive effects in humans, the report said, studies of cognitive function and human performance do not suggest acute effects of exposure to radiofrequency fields from mobile phones and base stations. 8 studies which had described adverse effects on cognition were hidden. 4 were omitted, and 4 others were scattered in other sections, so they weren't included in the conclusion, leading to an incorrect one. For effects on membranes, excluding the blood-brain barrier, the conclusion was, in general, most studies report finding effects on cell membranes. However, the variety of cellular systems and exposures makes comparisons of the effects on cell membranes problematic, and without independent replication, it's difficult to assess the robustness or even the validity of the findings. So the take-home message was that comparisons of the effects were problematic. They weren't replicated, they weren't robust, and may not even be valid. But all 17 studies included had reported effects on membranes. 100%, all of them. This was twisted to suggest that there was no robust effect. This was a misleading conclusion and the evidence was belittled. For direct effects on proteins, the report said, in general, most of the studies that have investigated changes in protein function or structure due to exposure to RF fields have found effects. However, the effects have not been demonstrated to be robust by independent replication. But 15 out of 16 studies included 94% from 14 different groups reported effects on proteins. The report twisted this around to suggest that the effects were not robust. This was highly misleading and evidence, again, was belittled. The executive summary stated there are now several hundred studies in the published literature that have looked for effects on isolated cells or their components when exposed to RF fields. None of them have provided robust evidence for an effect. But 97% of studies on cell membranes and proteins described effects. But the conclusion made the evidence disappear and dishonestly gave the impression that there were no effects, leading to an incorrect, inaccurate and misleading conclusion. Incorrect and misleading conclusions have also been made for development, pregnancy, genetic damage and brain activity. I won't go through all of these now, but they're in the slides in case you're interested in them later. So looking back at the overall AGNIR conclusion, the evidence considered overall has not demonstrated any adverse health effects of RF field exposure below internationally accepted guideline levels. This was the conclusion when 78% of studies reported damage to male reproductive health. 97% of studies had effects on proteins and cell membranes. 79% of studies had increase in the damaging condition of oxidative stress. 80% of studies showed loss of cells in the brain from prenatal or neonatal exposures. 52% of studies showed evidence of genetic damage. The conclusion was false and not evidence-based. It was incorrect and misleading. UK radio frequency exposures and the use of wireless devices, included by babies and children, are based on this scientifically inaccurate and misleading report. The evidence of harm has been covered up. This ought to be a public scandal, similar to the harmful effects of tobacco, being covered up for years, or the falsification of VW emissions data. The evidence of harm from wireless technologies has been hidden by UK official advisory bodies. The current exposures are not protective of health. Parents who give their children smartphones, and schools who give their children wireless computers in the classroom need to know about this. A few months after the paper was published, AGNIR was quietly disbanded. But the inaccurate AGNIR report is still being used by Public Health England to support their advice. COMAR is now Public Health England's advisory group, but it has the same secretariat as AGNIR, who is a contributor to the inaccurate AGNIR report and also part of ICNIRP. The Secretariat is responsible for advising COMAR when they need to look at the evidence. They haven't yet been advised. So the UK official advisory group is still under the control of ICNIRP. In addition, Public Health England are withholding information. The R classification of RF fields as a possible human carcinogen was omitted from the AGNIR report. But they've also removed this classification from their current website. They are therefore withholding appropriate specialist advice, which according to the Parliamentary Health and Health Service Ombudsman is a form of maladministration. This prevents decision makers or the public being able to make informed decisions. The link at the bottom of the slide is for anyone that couldn't find it on the Public Health England website. Public Health England have also said that there's no reason why schools or other places should not use Wi-Fi. They've never admitted that adverse effects of Wi-Fi exist, even though many studies have described adverse effects. The evidence has been withheld from the public, preventing them from making an informed choice. Some of the studies are listed at wifiandschools.org.uk/30. But members of ICNIRP were also authors of the inaccurate AGNIR report. International radio frequency exposure guidelines are written by ICNIRP. Members have produced incorrect, inaccurate and misleading scientific information upon which public health and wireless infrastructure decisions have been based. This calls into question the validity of the international exposure guidelines. ICNIRP have used the same writing style as AGNIR, and I'd like to illustrate this with one example. In their draft health risk assessment, published in July 2018, they didn't include any studies on oxidative stress, but they did say that although some effects have been reported for functions such as oxidative stress, there was no evidence of effects relevant to human health. In a different section on cancer, they said that oxidative stress was a process which was of particular relevance to cancer. So increased oxidative stress was dismissed as not being relevant to health, and the evidence disappeared. I mentioned in the Views on Environmental Health paper 8 references as examples of how oxidative stress is relevant to human health. The Swedish Radiation Safety Authority published a report in April 2018. One of the authors was the chair of ICNIRP. The report mentioned some cell and animal studies indicate that EMF exposure may cause oxidative stress even at low exposure levels. So they're admitting that there may be increases in oxidative stress. But it's unclear what relevance this may have when it comes to direct health effects in humans. Again, it was dismissed as not being relevant to health, allowing the evidence to disappear. Many official advisory bodies are interrelated and linked to ICNIRP. ICNIRP members account for about half of the members of the World Health Organization EMF project. They're present in AGNIR, they're present in Public Health England and the Department of Health. They're present in the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority. They're present in ARPANSA in Australia. And they're present in CENIR, the advisory group for the European Commission. They all include members of ICNIRP, and they all report no health effects below the ICNIRP guidelines, where there's a conflict of interest. In turn, members of the WHO EMF project and governments feed back to support ICNIRP. When they're being given the guidelines that they want, no matter what the science is or how poor the science might be, then they support it. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. ICNIRP guidelines allow economic growth through the development of wireless telecommunications. Some official bodies around the world are admitting to adverse effects below ICNIRP guidelines, and some are taking action. The government of Cyprus is informing the public about health risks and the need to take action. They have a recent video for teenagers. They're removing Wi-Fi from schools, and in the Nicosia resolution last year, they gave advice as to actions that are needed. France has banned Wi-Fi in preschools and mobile phone use by pupils in schools. Scientists have also been speaking out for years, most recently in the EMF Scientist Appeal at emfscientist.org and in the 5G Appeal, 5gappeal.eu. There's been a response from the European Commission to the 5G Appeal, and that was that the EU follows the ICNIRP guidelines and advice from CENIR, and mobile communication technologies will be the backbone of Europe's future economy. The EMF Scientist Appeal did not receive a response from the World Health Organization or the United Nations. The United Nations supports the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it also has a specialised agency to promote and defend telecommunications throughout the world, the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. ITU has membership of 193 countries and almost 800 private sector entities and academic institutions, including the mobile wireless industry, governments, organisations who use wireless signals, and in the UK that includes the BBC, BT, Vodafone, GSMA, UK Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sports. The public trusts the United Nations, the World Health Organization and Public Health England to take action to keep them safe. but there are conflicts of interest for wireless technologies because they're good for economic growth, and groups have been set up to protect and promote them, including within the United Nations. In my view, an organisation cannot protect human rights whilst also actively protecting an industry which produces something which damages life. We have a challenge. How do we effectively challenge and correct incorrect and inaccurate official advice when it's economically advantageous and needed, supported and protected by governments and industry? I'd also like to talk about risk assessment. The Department for Education in England has said in a letter to Diana Hanson, coordinator of the Safe Schools IT Alliance, that it's for individual schools to decide whether or not to implement Wi-Fi technology in order to meet their needs. Schools must take reasonable steps to ensure that staff and pupils are not exposed to their health and to risks to their health and safety by conducting a risk assessment and, if necessary, putting measures in place to minimise any known risk. The Department for Education in Northern Ireland has also said schools need to perform risk assessments on the technologies within their school to ensure that they are fully aware of and can mitigate the potential risks involved with their use. So schools are responsible and are expected to carry out a risk assessment before the technologies are introduced and used. In the government's document Working Together to Safeguard Children, safeguarding children is defined as protecting children from maltreatment and preventing impairment of children's health and development. It's this preventing impairment of children's health and development which is relevant for radiofrequency radiation. Everyone who works with children has a responsibility for keeping them safe. They don't have a responsibility to support incorrect government information or the wireless industry. I've written an example risk assessment for schools, which you can find at the website wirelessriskassessment.org. It's a standard school risk assessment form, which describes the likelihood of the risk occurring as well as the severity. The overall risk is then the likelihood multiplied by the severity. The document is separated in different uses of wireless technologies often used in schools or workplaces, along with recommendations for reducing the risks. Hazards are backed up by published scientific papers. Schools can take action to reduce exposures, even if Public Health England and ICNIRP continue to deny harmful effects. When we have Wi-Fi throughout all schools, hospitals and homes, children have no choice and no escape. When children are given wireless devices by responsible adults, including schools, they have no choice and no escape. When we have Wi-Fi in all university accommodation, young people have no choice, despite the current increasing mental health concerns and effects of wireless signals on brain activity, function, development and behaviour. We're failing to safeguard children and young people if we're exposing them to something which scientific studies have shown can cause physical harm and increase cancer risk. I want to mention adverse effects. I'm only going to mention one example because of the limit of time. Wireless radiofrequency signals in animal studies can trigger cell death. And animal studies have described cell death in the brain, the testes, the liver, heart, kidneys and ovaries. I'm focusing on this slide on the ovaries. The studies in the table have all described significant loss of ovarian follicles following radiofrequency signal exposures. I'm not expecting you to read it, but it's here if you'd like the evidence as a reference at a later date. I've not seen any papers which have quantified the effects on follicle numbers and not found some sort of loss of follicles. They all have reported loss of follicles. The follicles develop to release the eggs, so their loss would irreversibly decrease female reproductive health. The first 4 studies are in rats, in adult rats, young rats, and then following that, there are 2 where they've exposed pregnant rats and looked at the ovaries in the female offspring. They've all reported significant loss in follicles. The bottom one was a range of studies by Lucas Margaritis' lab in Greece and Dimitri Panagopoulos, who's here today, in fruit flies. And they've exposed fruit flies to Wi-Fi signals, Bluetooth, DECT cordless phones and GSM mobile phones, and all of them have reported cell death in the ovaries. The exposures were from 6 minutes up to an hour, and they range from 0.3 volts per metre up to near IGNAP guidelines. But 0.3 volts per metre is now very commonly found in cities, towns, homes and classrooms. So are wireless signals killing ovarian follicles in humans, thereby damaging reproductive health? I've not seen any studies that have been published on this. But evidence from animals points to a need to restrict the use of devices near reproductive organs to prevent irreversible physical harm to babies, children, young people and women of reproductive age. As you can see, use of tablets is very close to reproductive organs. So in summary, we need accurate official reports and documents to be corrected or retracted, including AGNIR 2012. We need conflicts of interest to be properly addressed. We need mechanisms put in place so that inaccurate government information can be challenged, corrected or retracted, because important decisions and laws are based on them. Official advice needs to be updated based on accurate information and protecting the public, not the telecommunications industry. We need honest advisory bodies independent of IGNIR, AGNIR, telecommunications industry and governments. We need more scientists to speak out when official advice is inaccurate, to raise the quality of science being used to guide decision makers. We need schools and people with safeguarding responsibilities to question official advice and to do the right thing to protect those for whom they have a responsibility. And there is the example risk assessment for schools. Schools, universities and hospitals can offer wide internet connections and switch the Wi-Fi off. We need non-wireless working environments to be offered, especially for pregnant women, and education of the public of possible adverse health effects so they can make informed decisions. Because harming children and young people is wrong, no matter how economically advantageous or how difficult it is to make changes. Thank you for listening.